Hello and welcome everyone. Thank you all for joining us today for this live stream event. Before we begin, I'd like to quickly review two items, our code of conduct and the event guidelines. So for the code of conduct, Microsoft Reactor seeks to provide a respectful environment for both our audience and our presenters. We encourage engagement in the chat, but we just ask that you're mindful of your commentary, remaining professional and on topic. This session is recorded. It will be available on demand through the Microsoft Reactor YouTube channel in about 48 to 72 hours. I'll share the link in the chat for our overall channel if you're tuning in from elsewhere. If you have not been on a live stream before with YouTube, just note that to interact in the chat, you do have to have an account set up with them. So now is a good opportunity as any to do that. If you don't have an account set up and you have questions that you weren't able to ask on the stream, feel free to reach out to us through Meetup with any questions. So today's session. Today we are joined by Sydney Andrews, Microsoft MVP. He'll be going through deploying Azure services using Azure Resource Manager from the CLI and templates. So let me pull up Sydney here on the screen.
Hey everyone.
Hello, Sydney. Welcome, welcome. Glad to have you back. Currently, Sydney is also simultaneously running a cloud skills challenge. He's got, so much energy and contributions to give to the Reactor. So we're really grateful to have you continuing on with us on this journey.
I'm glad to be here.
Very glad to have you. I'll let you take over from here. Thank you, and feel free to reach out, anyone.
All right. So just like we were saying earlier, if you got comments, please throw them in the chat. I'm gonna be looking at the side of my screen, looking at the chat, my demo notes. But I'm Sydney Andrews. I'm a Microsoft Azure MVP and a Microsoft certified trainer. I'm really excited today to show you the first part of a 3-part series. Every Wednesday for the next 3 weeks, where we're going to be looking at how to do Azure deployments using Azure Resource Manager, the CLI, and JSON and Bicep templates. We'll be looking at how to use GitHub Actions and YAML. And then on the third and final week, we'll put it all together and we'll use GitHub Actions to deploy ARM templates or Bicep templates so that you can actually automatically deploy stuff to Azure. So I don't know if my screen could be shared right now, but yeah, basically here's our nice little graphic. I'll show this every time before we start, but this week and next week's sessions will be just really the basics of what you need to know for each platform, so that when we come together April 6th, we're going to mix them together and make a really good a milkshake of Azure awesomeness. So see a couple howdies in the chat. Again, thank y'all for jumping in the chat. Got questions, please send them. You're going to see links coming up to a Microsoft Learn module that's going to help you go over some of the material I'm covering today, and links to my notes on GitHub. I think I have a GitHub, and I'm going to pronounce this wrong, a GitHub gist with all of my code from today's show. That way you can just go ahead and copy it and use your own subscription. So this is it. This is my only slide. I'm going to go ahead and hit the escape button, and I'm going to first talk about Azure Bicep and ARM. Basically, Azure Resource Manager is really just a RESTful API for us to use JSON to deploy resources to Azure. And you can use the Azure CLI. You can manually go in and run commands. You can use these JSON templates yourself using the Azure Resource Manager templates and build this JSON out manually. You can look at it in a portal and see what it looks like. And you can use the newer Bicep language to do a lot of the same stuff. And so today, what I hope to do is show you at least 4 different ways to deploy stuff. And my favorite thing to deploy is called is a storage account. So I have the Azure portal open, and I'm going to just create a storage account. So I'm going to go create storage account. And from here, I'm just going to go with some of the basic settings. I'm really going to ignore a lot of the more advanced stuff. So I'll create a new resource group. I'm going to call this resource group my example resource group. And I have many subscriptions. I just use my little learning subscription, would be fine there. And I give it a storage account name that's sort of random. We're going to put it in the West US region. And then I'm just going to leave it standard performance, locally redundant storage because I'm very cheap, and hit review create. And I want to pause right here because normally we create something in the portal, we hit the create button right here. But if we hit download a template for automation, it's going to actually take us to the Azure Resource Manager template equivalent, what we're about to deploy. And I don't really expect you to understand everything here yet, but I just wanted to point that out. If you've never used it before, it has a template with 26 parameters, all the different things you can enable or disable using that wizard. And then it's deploying 3 resources. The first one being a storage account, the second resource being blob services, and the third one being let me make sure I have these correctly tied up, file services. So this is the most complex template, but today I'm going to teach you how to make these templates from scratch. We're going to build them manually. So I'm going to exit out. I'm not going to create this resource. Go back to the Azure portal, and I'm going to open up my dangerous tools today. I have Visual Studio Code open, but you can definitely do this in a tool like GitHub Code Spaces. And I have the Windows Terminal. I'm running the preview edition. I have the latest PowerShell installed on here, and they're both pointing at the same empty folder, just a folder called ARM. So nothing too crazy so far. I'm going to log into Azure CLI with Easy Login. And Easy Login is going to open my browser and have me sign into my account. So I'm so glad I have my phone next to me for the good old-fashioned two-factor authentication. If you haven't enabled this, please do. I have my phone up, going to type in the number, do Face ID for the type of phone I have. That biometrics is different depending on the phone you have. If I jump back here, it's going to have me logged in, and now it's looking for all the subscriptions for which I have access. I have a lot of subscriptions, so you can see a nice long JSON array. I'm going to clear my screen because that's completely irrelevant. I'm going to show you a really cool command: AZ account set subscription, and I can specify which subscription I want to use for the remaining commands. So I'm going to use that same LRN subscription, and I'm logged in. So from here, I can get dangerous. I'm going to use AZ. I'm going to type in the right letters. AZ group create. I'm going to zoom in just a little bit. AZ group create name, and I'm going to call this demo, my demo group, lowercase demo, because I don't want to constantly have type on a capital D. I'll forget it. And location is West US. Hit enter. I'm going to create a new resource group called demo that's located in West US. If I jump back over to the Azure portal, go to resource groups, go ahead and refresh. Let me make sure I'm in the right subscription. There we go. There's my demo resource group. All right, so I'm ready to actually kick in stuff. Let's first talk about the Azure CLI itself. So with the Azure CLI, it comes with some commands that allow us to create things. So for instance, if we want to create a storage account, we can use AZ storage account create. And if you, again, all the show notes is in that GitHub gist, so you can go in and just look at them if you want to follow along with what I'm doing. But AZ storage account create creates a storage account and really only needs to name a resource group. You can specify other things, like for instance, you can specify a location and a SKU. So we're going, well, I think that is the minimum. So name, resource group, location, SKU. Let's try it out. If I'm wrong, I'm wrong. AZ storage account create. And I'm purposefully showing you how to do this using documentation because I expect you to be able to go look at the documentation yourself and figure these things out. So AZ storage account create name. We are going to call this Sydney first or Sid first store, or you know what, Sid store first. I don't know. I'm really indecisive on names today. My resource group is going to be called demo. My location is going to be West US. And for my SKU, well, let's go look at the documentation again. We have for SKU, let me scroll all the way down to SKU. It's a lot of flags that start with the letter E. We have the premiums, the standards. There's standard locally redundant storage or standard LRS. That's what I want. So standard LRS. Don't have any typos. Should just begin the process of creating a storage account. There we go. Starting running. And you're going to see that starting running a lot today. Let's just jump back in. This is my demo resource group. Nothing's been deployed yet, but just let it run. And again, I'm looking at the chat. If you got any questions, please send them. There's our Sit Store First resource group. our resource group, our demo resource group, and our SID store first storage account. I'm getting too excited here. We have a part blob, file endpoints, queue table, all the properties you expected after you create a resource. So if I go in and refresh, there we go. So there's my SID store first storage account. We're cooking. So that's the easiest way with the CLI, right? But the Azure CLI also has the ability for us to create a resource using the Azure Resource Specification. So just to show you what that looks like, there is a really great, and again, this is all in the show notes. There's a really great site where we can look at the different resource specifications. So here we can, I've already navigated to Microsoft storage accounts, and it says, hey, for this resource, the type is Microsoft Storage/storage accounts. The latest API version is 2021-08-01, but I can always choose a different API version. This allows me to lock in to the minimum required properties and everything at one point in time, even if the service evolves and has new minimum required properties. As long as I'm locked into an API version, I don't have to go update my scripts or update any templates. So I'm going to lock into 2021-08-01. So the type is Microsoft Storage/storage accounts. The API version is 2021-08-01. And a whole bunch of stuff that means absolutely nothing to me right now. But if I scroll all the way to the bottom, I have a property values table. It says to create the storage account, you need a type, which in this example is Microsoft storage accounts. You need an API version. In this example, 2021-08-01. Zoom in just a little bit there. And then you need, zoom out, the name of the storage account, and then the location of storage account. Now, there's two other things you're going to want to specify: the kind of storage account. For these demos, I'm going to use storage v2, and you want to specify the SKU of the storage account. Now, here it doesn't give us a value. It says, hey, here's a hyperlink, because SKU is a complex object. So if I click this hyperlink, it takes me to the SKU object, where it requires a property called name, and that's where we specify our standard LRS. So if we want to create an Azure Resource Usage Manager, we really need to create a JSON object. So go into Visual Studio Code, go create a file called storage.json. I'm going to put a nice little JSON object in here. And in this JSON object, I'm going to specify all those things we talked about. So location, West US, kind, this is going to be a storage v2, SKU, name, standard LRS. And this is based upon that documentation I just showed you. I was able to create a JSON object to describe the type of storage account I want to create. Now you may say, well, I thought you talked about the type of resource, the API version, name. Trust me, I'm coming to that in just a second. So we have another link I want to share with you. Again, all of this in the show notes. And that's to the AZ resource create command. This allows us to create any resource as long as we know the specifications for that resource. So here they have lots of examples how to use it, but the simplest example is AZ resource create, the name of the resource group, the type of resource. You can optionally specify API version. We'll do just that. Whether it's a full JSON object or not, this is a full JSON object, so we'll use that. And then a properties flag that'll point to the actual JSON configuration file. And by the way, this @ symbol will work just fine in Bash, but if you're using PowerShell, you're going to have to escape it. Just because PowerShell, I forget, it's called a scatter, I believe. I'm not as well versed as PowerShell, but you will have to escape that. So let's try it out. So AZ resource create. I have to spell resource correctly. Name. So the first storage account was called SID store first. So we'll call this SID store second. The name is SID store second. Resource group. That's going to be demo. And from here, we're going to specify a resource type. This is going to be Microsoft.storage accounts. API version, that's going to be 2021. I'll put this in 2021-08-01. Make sure I have all that spelled correctly. Is full object. And my properties, this is where we're going to want to escape. And I think we call that file storage.json. Just double check in Visual Studio Code. Our file is indeed called storage.json. So hit enter. And Pending no typos. Fingers crossed with no typos. We should be able to create a storage account. There we go. It's spin up a storage account. If we go back to the Azure portal and refresh, hasn't created it yet. You also notice it doesn't indicate that we're doing any deployments because we're doing this stuff straight from the CLI. We're not actually creating a templated deployment. But we are creating a storage account. It's running now. There's our SID store second .blob.core.windows.net. That's our blob endpoint. So storage account is definitely being created. Might have to refresh a couple times here in the portal to get it to show up. Mostly because I have like heavy caching enabled for stuff. Usually when I mess around with subscriptions, I have a lot of stuff going on. We might have to jump back into the portal and look at that. There we go. SID store second. So everything's there. I'm going to go back and I'm going to take this to the next level. See, when we looked at that JSON file, we kind of got a sniff of what a JSON-based Azure Resource Manager template looks like. And I want to take it all the way there. So we're going to create a storage.armdeploy.json. The actual name of the JSON file doesn't really matter, but it's common to use arm deploy somewhere in that name to indicate that it's an Azure Resource Manager JSON template. So I have this JSON file open, and I'm going to go to documentation because if we jump it back to documentation, again, all of this is in the show notes. They have the structure syntax arm templates. Basically, you need a schema, you need a content version, and a resources array. And if you go down to the table, just like what we saw with the Azure CLI, it says you absolutely need a schema. You need to point to schema management azure.com deployment template.json. So we'll create a JSON file, schema. We'll point to that schema file. See what else is kicking up. I want you to notice something really cool. I have the Azure Resource Manager extension installed in Visual Studio Code already. Here it is. So because I put that schema in, the extension said, oh, this is an ARM template. Okay, I'm kicking up all the really cool tools for ARM templates. So you don't have to go and manually enable them. Go down to content version that says, hey, you have to provide this, but you can provide any value. This is really for you to document significant changes to your template. So I'm going to just create a content version here. And I'm going to just do 1.0.0, just this first version of the template. And the last thing was a resources array. This is where we put the list of things that we want to deploy. Now, the cool thing about this is when we create a JSON object and we jump back, we can actually go back to our storage account documentation and see an example of how to create a storage account. Basically, you need a type, API version, and name. So we can go ahead and create that. Our type is Microsoft storage accounts. API version is 2021-08-01. For the name, we specify names. So I think we did, for the last one, we did, let's see, SID store second. So we'll just jump back and make this, actually, I clicked something by accident. SID store third. That'd be a good name here. And then for the rest of the properties, we just use the same properties we have in this JSON file. The only difference here is that in the ARM template, we specify that type, API version, and name. Now, you'll see all the squigglies went away. Syntax is validated. We're good to go. But if just in case I didn't know all of this, I could always use the shortcuts, ARM storage, and it'll give me their version of a storage account resource. So here it uses a different API version. It adds tags, and it uses a premium SKU. Also adds some really interesting stuff around the location, which we will get to in a second. But I just want to show you that you don't have to manually type this out. You can use the tools built in, but I like to manually type it out just to show you where it came from, what's going on there. Just in case you didn't know how any of this works, you can go to resources.azure.com, just like you'll go to portal.azure.com, and this will take you to the Azure Resource Explorer. I believe you can also view this through the portal. If we go to subscriptions and LRN, which is my learning subscription, resource groups, and demo, and select resources, I'll see my two storage accounts. So just in case I didn't know the syntax, I can go here, see name, type, SKU, kind, location, and get some hints into how to fill up this JSON template. All right, so I got the template together. I'm going to go into the Windows terminal, and I'm going to deploy this. Now, before I deploy it, I actually need to look up an Azure CLI command, and This one we did AZ Resource, but this time instead of Azure Resource Manager, we're going to do AZ Deployment Group. So AZ Deployment Group allows us to do a template deployment at a resource group. Now you can do template deployments at other levels, at a subscription level, management group levels. It's pretty cool. But today we're going to focus on resource groups because it's just really simple to learn that way. So AZ Deployment Group create, we specify a resource group, and then we can give the deployment a name. We can point it at a template, whether it's a URI, a file, and then we can optionally specify parameters, either bake in the parameters manually or specify a parameters file. So a lot of this looks really similar to that AZ resource command. Let's give it a shot. So AZ deployment group create, resource group, it's called demo, and my template file, that's storage armdeploy.json. Hit enter. Again, fingers crossed for no typos. We are cooking. Now, this is really cool because if I go into the Azure portal, since this is a template deployment, I should see something under deployments. And there we go. It created a deployment called storage.armdeploy. All right, we got a question in the chat. What is the schema in the JSON file? Now, in one of the links in the gist I shared, it actually walks you through the schema right here, which is the schema management azure.com deployment template.json. So think of that as a fixed schema that you want to use for your ARM templates. They reference it quite a lot in the examples. So that's where that came from. Again, if you need a link to that, we have I believe we dropped in the chat earlier, the gist I'm using for my show notes. And that's pretty cool because that's where we can go in and there's a link to this template format and it talks about why I use that schema. All right, so we deployed our storage account. Just jumping back over to the Azure portal, a refresh. There's sit store third that was just created using that JSON template. I mean, and there's other stuff we can do here. I don't want to spend too much time on JSON templates because I think the exciting part is the bicep templates. But I did want to show you that we can take values and not make them baked in. So for example, I want to create a variable called default location. I can do that by specifying location. I can hard code it as West US. And then if I want to use that variable, I can go down to location and use square brackets for the scripting syntax for JSON templates. So I can say variables and reference default location. And that'll work just fine. The other thing I could do is I can even calculate it using the script too. So I can go resource group dot location, and what it'll do, and this is a good practice to do anyways, is it'll actually read my resource group's location, which I believe is West US, and then use that value for the location here. So it reads the resource group location, stores a variable called default location, and then reuse that. How about those draft principles, right? Now, the other thing we could do is we can go to parameters and create a set of parameters. Now, this one, I know the syntax, but I just want to show you what that looks like. We can create a parameter called storage account name, and we have an object where we can set different things. But today, I'm just going to focus on the type of the storage account name, which is string. But we can also set other things like min length. Let's make that 3. Max length, let's make that 24, which I think that's the settings for storage accounts anyways. I'm double checking my notes. Yes, it is. And then if we want to use this parameter, you see the squiggly, it's just saying that we never use this parameter. We can use it down here for names. So use that square bracket syntax, parameters, we'll reference the storage account name. So really, really cool stuff. And this gives us a much more complex template to use. We can, with this parameter though, we need to specify. So if I actually tried to deploy this again, so I'm going to run this deploy command, but I'm going to do one new thing. If we run it again, it's going to use the name of the file. Storage.armdeploy is the name of the deployment. That's not going to be really useful for us. So I'm going to give a new name, call this first deployment. Enter. And it says, okay, you have a parameter called storage account name. Please provide a value. So let's see. Sit store third is the last one we use. So we'll say sit store fourth. And now it's running our deployment. If I go into the Azure portal and go to list of deployments, There's first deployment. And I just want you to see what's going on here. We have our inputs tab. It says for storage account name, I provided the value sit store forth. And for the template, you'll see that we have one variable called default location, one parameter called storage account name, and then one resource, which is our storage account itself. So really simple template to create a storage account called sit store forth. If I go to resource, you'll see that storage account right here. Really, really cool stuff. I'm going to go back to my demo resource group, and we're going to keep cooking. We are going to clear the screen so I have a little bit more room, and we are going to try and provide our own parameters. So I'm going to run this command again, but instead of first deployment, I'm going to say JSON deploy with param, and I'm going to add another flag called parameters. And this is where I can manually specify my parameters. So storage account name equals, I think this is sit store fifth we're working on at this point. So I hit enter. And you see now it doesn't query me for that parameter because I provided it as part of running the command. So we're going to just jump back into the portal, go to our deployments. There's JSON deploy with param. And we don't even have to wait for the storage account to be finished. It's sit store fifth. We'll see our input is sit store fifth. We don't have any outputs yet. And we have our template, which hasn't changed. We just changed the command that we ran. So we just effectively reuse the same template. Now we could go and keep cooking. Like for example, sit store fifth is just done. If we go to resource, we'll see that we have a new storage account called sit store fifth. If I go back to my demo resource group, I'm going to show you something really cool. Even though we've created this manually using the command, we could optionally use a parameters file. Now, I can never remember the syntax for a parameters file. It's on the documentation page, but Visual Studio Code has a really cool feature. We can hit select or create a parameter file for full validation. So I hit here and I'll say a new parameters file. That's going to ask, do you want to specify all parameters in this file or just the required ones? Well, I'm going to specify all parameters. It creates a new file. It just adds dot parameters to the name. So storage arm deploy dot parameters JSON. Hit save. And there's our parameters file. It has a single parameter called storage account name. So I should just be able to just jump in and say sit store fifth. Now you might say, hey, Sydney, you've already deployed sit store fifth. And this is where I tell you, and if I mispronounce this, I apologize, that Azure Resource Manager template deployments, they're output. So basically, if I deploy the same template with the same settings again and again and again, it will check to see if that account or resource exists already with those same settings. And if it does, it'll skip that deployment. So this allows us to iteratively build out our templates if we're going to build more complex. And I know that's beyond the scope of today, but it's really cool if you need to build out a template with like 15 or 16 different resources, which I've had to do many times in the past. So we have our AC deployment group create command. We're going to call this JSON deploy with param file. Hope that name's not too long. Parameters. Well, I'm going to skip the parameter file name. I'm going to say storage on deploy parameters.json. So that basically says read in this JSON file and pass in the JSON string to the parameters. Now you can manually put in the JSON string here, but I'm pretty sure you don't want to do that. So we're going to hit enter. And if I get this right, our deployment is started. We go to deployments. There's JSON deploy with param file. Now I want to call out something really cool here. You probably noticed that the param file deployment was super fast, only 2 seconds versus 20 something seconds for the other ones. And that's because the resource status is okay, not created. Essentially, this sit store fifth already existed. So it validated that we use storage account name and this template and basically said, okay, since that resource already exists, I can skip it. As long as it already exists and it has the same configuration, I can skip that step of deployment. So if I need to add more stuff, this allows me to keep building on the same template, redeploy, no problem. This becomes really useful if you're deploying like app services stuff, and the only thing you want to change out is maybe your actual deployment resource. It's really cool stuff. So that's how we do ARM templates using both built-in parameters and a parameters JSON file. But I want to take this to the next level. Basically, I really like Bicep. I think Bicep's a lot easier to parse and a lot easier to read. So we are going to open up the documentation page for Bicep. And it talks about, hey, if you want to create a bicep file, you can target a certain scope, whether it's a subscription management group or or resource group. You can specify parameters with decorators to specify things like, min length, max length. You can specify variables. You can specify a list of resources. You can even specify output. And we're going to go through all of that. So let's actually create our first bicep file. So storage.bicep is going to be the name of our bicep file. And since I use the .bicep extension, Visual Studio Code already knows I want to use the bicep language service. It's going to give me really rich autocomplete here. So I'm going to start with resource. I'm going to call this resource storage account. And I need to give it a type. So Microsoft.storage. Ooh, I got to type this correctly. Microsoft.storage, storage accounts. And then an @ symbol for the version, which is our API version, 2021-0801. Equals, then I'll open brackets so I can actually type out this resource. Now, if I hover over here, it says, okay, you have a resource declaration, but for Microsoft storage/storage accounts, you're going to need to specify the kind, the location, the name, and the SKU. Well, we already have a lot of experience doing that, so let's just type that out. So name, we're going to call this Sid Store 6. Hope I got my count correct. Location, let's make that West US. Kind, storage v2. You see nice little IntelliSense. And SKU is an object. So if we hit tab here, it'll create the object with required properties, or we can just create the object. And you'll notice I have squigglies and it says, hey, you need to specify the name for the SKU, just like we did in JSON. So SKU, standard LRS. So a lot less typing that needs to happen here, but the concepts are the same. And that was the big thing I really wanted to show here. So if we take this is the part you're going to love. The command is also the same. So AZ deployment group create. The name of the resource group we're going to deploy to is demo. And our template file, this time instead of using the JSON file, we'll use storage.bicep. I hit enter. It's going to create a new deployment using a storage.bicep file. Now it's sitting there giving me a warning. It says, hey, you really shouldn't hard code your location, but it's going to deploy anyways. It's just saying that's not a good practice. We'll fix that in a second. I'll go back to my browser and go back to this demo resource group, refresh my deployments. And there's a deployment called storage, because just like with the ARM template, it uses the file name as the default name. So Sid Store 6 is being deployed. If we go to inputs, I don't have any inputs, don't have any outputs. But if we go to template, this is the fascinating part. It actually automatically generated a ARM JSON language template based upon what I just typed out in Bicep. So it's pretty cool to actually see the how similar that is to the template we created earlier. So go in, looks like my resources created. If I go to overview, there's my Sid Store 6 resource group. Let's play around with this just like we did with the JSON templates. So let's just jump in and this is where we can start specifying things like parameters. So for example, I might want to create a parameter called default location equals, it's a type string, and I can have it open so that somebody has to specify default location, and I can use it down here by just referencing default location, and everything's good to go. I can also give a default value, so you don't have to specify default location unless you really want to, using that same scripting syntax that we saw in the JSON template. So resource group dot location. So now I have a default location set on the storage account. It's a parameter. It can be overridden, but if not, it's going to use resource group dot location. So pretty cool stuff. Let's create a deployment using that. So AZ deployment, you know what? Just for fun, I'm going to leave the name the same, so it should be a fast deployment. So AZ deployment group create resource group demo template file storage.bicep, and the name of this is should already exist. Just because I know the location will be calculated as West US, so this should be a super fast deployment just because it's going to notice that this storage account already exists. So let's just go to our deployments. This should already exist, done in 3 seconds. We jump in, we'll see our inputs, default location using the default value West US. And there's our template with one parameter called default location. a type string with a default value already programmed in for us. So it's pretty cool that we're evolving our template now, right? We could go in and evolve even further. So we can create another param called storage account name, a type string. I don't have to give it a default value. I can force you to specify it using min length 3, max length 24. I can create variables var kind equals standard. Oh, storage v2. Let me use my single quotes here. Apologize. Var skew equals standard LRS. I can use those down here. So skew variable here, kind variable there, storage account name parameter here. And now it's starting to look more like, object-oriented code or any other type of code that you want to write, because I'm starting to get some reuse. I can create multiple resources if I like. If I try to deploy this, let's spin up that deployment command. This time I'm going to say using bicep with params. And this is where I can start having fun. I can specify my parameters, just like we did with the JSON template. So storage account name equals sit store 7th. Hit enter. Somebody said, why would you prefer var over param? Is there a reason why you wouldn't always use param? That is a argument for your team. Just like with code, if you have a method, what should be brought in as a method parameter and what should be an internal variable not accessible outside of the method. I say think of it that way. So for example, when I'm creating these, I may never want you to change what type of kind of skew we're creating. Maybe it's a policy I have. Whereas for the parameters, I specify these things with default values, but you can override them. So there's no technical reason why you can't use variables or why you can't use parameters instead of variables. It really just comes down to your team style and what you want to build and what the purpose of that is. And there we go. There's our sit store 7th. If we go over to our demo resource group and see our refresh, there's bicep with params. If we go in, our only input parameters are sit store 7th and west US. And our template, you'll notice is a little bit more complex. It has two variables, kind and skew, two parameters, storage account name, and default location. You'll notice it has the min and max length like we had earlier. The default location has default value, and is using that parameters and variable syntax to reference them. So for today's demo, I'm just mixing up parameters variables, but there's nothing stopping you from doing more complex stuff. So for example, one thing I see all the time, and I'm not going to really demo this today, but I usually see people do storage account prefix, and they take off the min length, and the max length may be 20. And then they'll have a variable called storage account name, which is equals to, and this is where they will concat storage account prefix. Well, actually, let's do suffix. Storage account suffix. And let's say sit store. The storage account suffix. So there's definitely lots of different ways you can do that, but just showing some flexibility in how we can do things for the question we had in the chat. Thank you for so much for that question. It really just comes down to team style, how you want to do things. One other thing I want to call out is that we have this parameters file. We could totally use this. So I have sit store 8th. I think I'm up to 8 now. So we save that. And then what I can do here is that I can take this parameters file and use it in this command. So I'm gonna have this command, but instead of bicep params, I'll say bicep or param file. Instead of parameters here, I will specify, and this is where I had to go get the super long file name, a parameters file, and it uses the same syntax. So if I hit enter, And it's running. So one more question in the chat. Somebody says, okay, if it's idempotent deployments, and if the resource already exists, it's going to skip it. Should I be using this to change an existing resource? There are strategies where you can use ARM to make changes to existing resources. I think of stuff like storage accounts where you're adding container resources, Cosmos DB where you're adding databases, app service where you're adding deployment child resources. But usually I recommend in a situation like this the replace methodology. So we're spinning up a new instance of this resource with the changes that we want, with a new name, and we're just changing wherever our DNS or routing is pointing from the old instance to the new instance, rather than try to use Armor Bicep to change existing resources. From a deployment methodology, it's just much easier to explain and implement a deployment where every new deployment of this service is a completely separate resource. All right, so we did all that, and just to show you real quick before I get to the next step, there's our bicep or parameters file. There's our inputs, sit, store, auth came from that parameters file. No outputs, and our template hasn't really changed at all. We just changed wherever we manually specify parameters or use the parameters file. All right, so we're really cooking. What I really like to do now is to take this storage account name and give it a default value. We can definitely use string concatenation, string interpolation. So store, and this is just another way to do the same thing I was showing earlier, and I can generate a unique string. The unique string method basically takes a seed and creates a random string from that seed. Now, obviously, if your seed is the same all the time, you're always going to get the same random string. So for this example, we're always deploying to the same resource group. So let's seed this with resource group.id, ensuring that we get the same random string each time. So it's a random string, but it's going to always be the same random string in multiple deployments. So just deploying this one more time, I'm going to get rid of my parameters and bicep with random name. It's going to be the name of this deployment. Give it a second to think about it. Deployment started. So if we go to our demo resource group and refresh, there's our bicep with random name. There's our store and a randomly generated string that was seeded by the resource group's unique ID. So for the inputs, you'll see that I was used as the storage account name. That's the default. And our default location is used. And our template, the only big difference here is under storage account name, we added the default value, which used the format function, function, which does essentially string interpolation for us. All right, there's our storage account resource. Everything looks really good so far. One last thing I want to show you is how to do an output in Bicep. Because let's say we were using this Bicep template as part of a more complex workflow, where once this storage account is created, we want access to maybe the storage account blob URI so we can begin performing operations against it right away. Our template doesn't have any outputs. And if you go to Outputs tab, you don't see any. So I'm going to just jump in, and I'm going to go to Bicep, and I'm going to type in output. I'm going to call it storage blob URL, and it's going to be a type string. Now, I don't have anything to put in here yet, but how do I figure this out? Well, we can use the trusty old Azure CLI, and I'm going to use AZ storage account. Earlier, we used create, but this time I'm going to use help. It shows all the different commands. So we created a storage account before. This time, we're going to show a storage account. So AZ storage account show. The name of the storage account, let's do, let's go grab this name from over here. And then resource group is called demo. It's going to show us the properties of this storage account. So lots of properties are really interesting here. Access tier, encryption, extended location. The one I'm really interested in is primary endpoints.blob. That gives us our blob URI that I want to be able to access after this template is done. So if I go back to my Bicep template, I can say storage account, which references this resource. So think of it like a variable reference in a resource, dot properties, dot primary endpoints, dot blob. And now I've created an output. So I haven't changed anything. It's going to generate a unique string, but it's using the resource group ID as the seed. So that unique string should be exactly the same as it was in the last deployment. If you remember, we are deploying a storage account with the same name and same properties. So it should just be a super fast deployment. So let's do AC deployment group create bicep with same name. And I mean, I could put in parameters, but it looks like everything parameter wise is tap. But if you just didn't trust it or you wanted to manually specify them, I could do storage account name equals and then go grab this name for the portal. And I could do another parameters flag. Default location equals and grab this value for the portal. Again, I knew if I deployed the bicep template right away, it'll have the same values, but just showing this as an example. So I hit enter, pending no typos. It should spin up, start the deployment, and it should be, again, another 2 or 3 second deployment. There we go. So we'll go back to our demo resource group, we'll refresh. Bicep was same name, refresh one more time. It was done in 4 seconds. Okay, this one was a little slower. So this resource already existed, so the status is okay. It checked for the existence of this resource. If we go to inputs, there's our storage account name, default location input. If we go to our template, we'll see we have our parameters, variables, resources. But at the end of our JSON template, we have an output called storage blob URL of type string. And it references our storage account name, dot primary endpoints dot blob, which is really confusing syntax if you never worked with this before. But if we go to outputs here, there's our storage blob URL. And so if we were running a complex script, you'll see that the output for this deployment is right here in the JSON object. So we could actually parse the output of AZ deployment group create to get our storage blob URL dot value and use this as part of a much more complex script. So that's everything I wanted to show today. Really excited to start in this 3-part series. Just showing the slide one more time. Basically, today we went over Azure Resource Manager, the Azure CLI, and how we can deploy things using both the CLI manually and using templates, whether they're using JSON or they're using a Bicep language. Our next session is going to be YAML and GitHub Actions. We'll look at manually creating GitHub Actions, workflows using YAML. We'll do a couple simple ones. Hopefully we'll have enough time. We'll even spin up a Docker container and build to a Docker registry. And then that's next week. On April 6th, 2 weeks from now, we're going to have a session where I'm going to show you how to take a GitHub action built manually using YAML and do a deployment of an ARM template, whether that's a JSON template or a Bicep template, automatically, so that your application can not only build out the application code, whether it's manual build or container build, but it also can perform an automated deployment of the resources you need to Azure. So again, this is part 1 of 3-part series. If you haven't set up, go into YouTube, set up the notifications. If you got any questions, I'm hanging around for just another minute to answer any questions, but there was been some really good questions so far. I'm glad I'm able to help everybody out. Somebody thanked us for session. We really appreciate y'all attending this live. It's always a lot of fun. So Rebecca, I think I'm going to hand this back to you.
Thank you so much. So while we give the audience a little bit more time to catch up and think about if they have any final questions, I'm just going to quickly cover. I dropped in the chat a link to our survey. If you have the opportunity, we do ask that you fill that out. It gives us a lot of great feedback about our audience, who you are, and kind of your level of learning. And helps us curate future content. Also, if you're not part of our community yet, if you just happen to come across this stream on YouTube or heard about it from a friend, we are on Meetup. You can find us. We're an international program. We have 12 physical spaces around the world. So find the place that's closest to your region. Just search for Microsoft Reactor through Meetup. Find the closest one, join that one, and keep an eye on the calendar. Right now, most of our sessions are virtual. We will be going back to like a hybrid type scenario, and probably depending on the location the coming weeks. You can find us on Twitter, and we also have a newsletter if you wanted to sign up for that, aka.ms/reactor email sign up. It looks like we got a couple of questions coming through into the chat. For Siegfried, same time of day for March 30th and April 6th. Yes, exactly. For the last session, it's just an hour later. So I would send you a link to the local Reactor page, but depending on where you're located, if you've joined us through a different one, I don't want to get it confused because we have it listed across multiple channels. So same place, same time. You'll find us on YouTube. Yep. And then we had this question. Any useful links to know more about your assigned managed identity using ARM template? I don't, Sydney.
I actually just shared that link on YouTube chat. I have the YouTube video on another screen. So I went ahead and just shared that.
Okay, I'll drop that into the chat right now. Thank you so much. Here we go. That should be going out to you, our audience, and I'll just pop that up on the screen. It's a bit long, but yeah, thank you all so much. I think that covers it. Sydney, thank you again. This was fantastic. Can't wait till the next one. And take care, everyone. Have a good one.